Yeah, maybe Dax, I'll get you to like kick it off a bit.
We're live now, so
All right, hold on. Let me tweet it out as well so that people know that we're going live right now. Going live now. I mean, people joining in on a Friday evening, that'd be dedication. Um, all right. Yeah, I guess if we're live, let's get started. So the topic that we wanted to talk about a little bit was a conversation that Dax started at roughly 9 o'clock last night. Was it? Was it? It felt like it was really late. It felt
no.
like it was. Was that?
I would say I would say 6 o'clock,
Okay, 6 o'clock.
6:30.
Yeah. Um, and it had something to do with sort of framework choices, which is basically this notion of there are a bunch of frameworks slash platforms out there. I'd say majority of them, and we're sort of included in the bucket as well, of folks that are very focused on how easy it is to get started with using their framework or platform, and the notion being, hey, you go on their landing page, it's like literally 3 commands, and you've deployed to production, to the edge, globally, whatever, right? Like all the different sort of permutations of like what you could do and how quickly you could do that. Um, and that has caused maybe in some ways, and there's an obvious reason why this exists, because things are way too complicated, and so making it simpler is always going to make sense. Um, but that has maybe made it so that there is a bit of a race to the bottom, I'd say, in the sense of everybody wants to be the easiest to do. Let's just call it app development, while ignoring the negative consequences that come with something that is really easy to sort of get started. And I think we've run into a couple of cases in the community, outside of the community, of folks that are then trapped in a situation where they have to migrate out of because of the choices that they have made. And today, I think like we have some thoughts, I guess, that we'd like to sort of share around that. I don't know, Dax, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I think the other thing that I've been thinking about that's kind of related to this is I think there's some of it is um like the companies behind these frameworks, the people behind these frameworks. I think we're all tempted to just focus on the easy angle, and that's partially like coming from people behind it, but it's like a reflexive thing that's also coming from kind of what engineers want and the way they think. So I think there's this temptation of feeling like if I just pick the right framework or just pick the right technology, I'm going to guarantee a certain fate for whatever I'm working on. And yeah, I think frameworks can do a lot for you, and picking a good one versus a mediocre one versus a bad one has like a meaningful impact. But it's just like a shared responsibility thing. Like the framework can do a bunch of stuff for you and guide you, but the reality is you can look at two companies that are using the exact same framework, and one could be like an incredible, amazing product, while the other can be, not so great. And the difference is the effort that the companies have put in, and there's really no getting around that. So there's no like framework that's going to save you. There's no framework that's going to guarantee any kind of result. My example for this, I talk about this way too much, but I always bring up linear because there's all this like crazy front end technology flying around out there, but linear is just a React application. If you look at how good that application is, it's all just from their skill set and their effort. And if you look at how bad some React applications are, clearly not the technology. Like it could have been the right choice for any company, but it just comes down to the way people use it.
Yeah. So the thing I think we want to maybe talk about a little bit today is because this conversation was obviously happening over Discord yesterday. Um, I think there's obviously sort of the ecosystem stuff of like what everybody else is doing, and then there's the bigger question, at least to us, of like what are we trying to do, and maybe crystallizing that a little bit more, because it is a tricky balance of things that are easy to sort of get started, but being maintainable in the long run. My thing, I think, to date had always been about the fact that it's a false dichotomy that you don't have to choose, that you should be able to do both. However, and I think this is the thing that we talked about yesterday. If you were to just focus on making something easy to get started, you could while ignoring the other one, you can potentially do a really, really good job up front.
I think we should give people some context on what are some of the things we're talking about. Like even for me, I'm not like super clear because YouTube we're mainly having the conversation. I was just want to throw something out there.
Yeah.
Like people wanted, like since very early they wanted the file-based structure for the API route. And so imagine you have like /users, you have a user directory with a get right, like a CRUD, different CRUD files, and the name of the Lambda function will be composed by concatenating all the directory hierarchy plus the file name. So with that, it's like very easy to get started. You probably don't even need to define routes in your API. You just give it a path, or even if you predefine the folder name to be API.
Yeah.
And like if you do that, you technically don't even need the construct anymore. You just have API folder
Right.
with all the routes, and the file name is making up the function name, which is all pretty. And yeah, would that be something falling along that line of like making it easy but hard to move
Yeah.
out of it?
Yeah. I mean, I think the poster child for this has always been parse. It's this it was so incredibly well done in terms of how easy it was to sort of get started, that ever since its, I guess, early demise, people have been chasing that ideal in almost every single sort of iteration of a product or a platform, like an app development product or a platform. So I put a little bit together. Let me share my screen here. Um, let's see. Where are we? Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
Yep.
There's some sort of a graph. Because I can't see the stream anymore. Anyway,
Wow, that was
I'm just
good.
gonna go off of this. What's that?
This
Okay.
was good. I thought you were new to Excalidraw.
No. What do you? No. I used to use Excel. I've been using it for a while.
Oh, so someone asked me. Maybe it was Frank that asked me what it was.
Yeah.
Really? How did Frank not know? You've seen me use this for a while.
Yeah, but I never cared.
until you had to go do it yourself.
Yeah.
So I just put down a bucket of these, and we'll go through the sort of different iterations here, and then obviously ending off with where I think we should be, and then obviously have a conversation around that. But to sort of start with, like, I was trying to graph out what the experience looks like while using one of these platforms, and I sort of have Next.js, Heroku, Superbase sort of listed here. But they're like effectively like every app development platform out there sort of falls under there, aside from the big clouds. And then again, even within the big clouds, like AWS, for example, has Amplify that you could sort of fall under there. But the definition of this bucket is a service where their primary focus is to make sure that it's really easy to sort of get started. And that's the main sort of selling point, and that's what the entire product is sort of anchored around. What I'm trying to display here is sort of the effort it takes to work and, I guess, maintain one of these applications across time. I'm not quite putting it down as like sort of zero effort. There's a little bit of effort. Almost all of these services, regardless of how easy they are to get started, there is a bit of a learning curve. It's a slight learning curve. Is kind of what I'm trying to show here. And then I think one of the really outstanding features of these products or these platforms is that for you to go, once you get past the initial learning curve, for you to go from that to an application in production. So I don't mean like your first deployment. I mean like once your thing is actually live and you've got users, is relatively smooth. And I think a lot of them do like a pretty good job at that. And again, you guys can sort of like chime in on your personal experiences, but in general, that's the sense that I've always gotten, was that they, right from your first sort of onboarding experience, you almost have an idea of what it's going to be like when you go into production. And it is effectively that. Like there might be a few bumps along the way, but let's just say it's roughly smooth getting to production. And I think this is sort of where the interesting part starts with a lot of these platforms, is that once you're in production and your application is growing in terms of usage, or your team is growing in size, both of those things typically happen together, you start hitting some of these bumps of, hey, I'm trying to do a certain thing and I don't know exactly how to do it. Case in point, maybe what triggered this conversation yesterday was that somebody was trying to do a cron job in Next.js Vercel, and it's been done through API routes, and there's sort of a hard limit. And at that point, what, if you sort of remember the parse days, like you end up basically working. So you still want to use the platform because effectively everything is on there, but you have to find sort of workarounds and hacks on how to kind of do it. So like I remember people trying to, I think Frank probably has a better idea of this, but like in the parse days, it was like the amount of work that you had to do to kind of like put scripts together, which again, like ironically very similar to what some of the issues are now with the current platforms, where people are like creating like dummy API endpoints to sort of run this stuff. But the idea is that like for each and every additional piece of functionality you're trying to add, whether it's cron jobs in this case, or scripts that you're trying to run, or something that the platform doesn't support, you basically have to put a bunch of work in to get the hack working. So that's sort of the climbing of the curve. And then you come back down to a point where, again, like your app is still functioning, everything's still sort of fine, you have this hack, except now that level is a little bit higher than before, in the sense that the amount of effort it takes to keep that app with that hack up and running is more than what your initial thing was. And then you just continually have these hacks. Over here, obviously I've sort of drawn out two of them, but this goes on for a while until you hit this brick wall, which is, look, there is this specific thing that we're trying to do. We actually either A, we can't do it because it's a cost thing, or B, it's we just cannot do it in-house. We need to use a different service for this, or we need to get out of this sort of platform. And that's basically the sort of migration wall. Like it's in this case, I'm trying to sort of display it as like something being sort of insurmountable, but effectively the fact is like the story of this platform sort of ends there. It's not that clear cut. For a lot of folks, I think what ends up happening is that they move parts of it off. So this is the case with Heroku. Like people still have portions of their platform or their product still on Heroku, but there are other parts of it that have just been moved off. And over time, they're able to like move other parts of it off, and maybe new development sort of happens elsewhere, or a bit of both. But that's roughly what it sort of looks like. And the point I'm trying to make here is that there are things that you can work around, but once you hit this sort of migration wall, there really isn't much you can do to work around. You actually have to do this at that point, and unfortunately, this is at a point when your app is and your team is sort of growing. I'll sort of pause there. I don't know if you guys have something to add. Obviously, Dax, you've got sort of experience with this. Maybe you want to sort of chime in.
Yeah, it's funny you bring up parse because like I think I've literally had that experience of joining a company that was using parse, and then it was kind of buckling over, and we had to try to migrate. I think a lot of my experience has been in that category. I'll join a company like during that hacks phase, and I spent a lot of time as a consultant, so it's typically when that happens. You join the hacks phase, then you like make the case for here's why you definitely need to migrate, and that's always really painful because the reason you're in that phase and the reason that like stuff is starting to fall over is probably because when your product is starting to do well and you have more customers, you have more features you didn't think that you needed to do, so it's like the worst time to have to go through all of that. And I spent almost a company again at the exact same experience, and I was like, oh, I wish I was there from the beginning because like this would have potentially turned out different. Then I got a chance to do it from the beginning, like when I started something really early stage. And I think I delayed this, but I also eventually ended up creating the same scenario. So it's hard to really focus on avoiding this. I think for most people, the concern is getting to prod. And there's a question of like, wow, like I've never built something like this before. Can I even do it? Can we even get there? That's where a lot of the energy goes. I think once you've been through that a few times, you start to not worry about that as much because you went from like not knowing much to figuring it out before, so you're not as worried with that. You're more worried about, I remember everyone hated working here after 2 years. I remember like every time we had to hire someone, we had to be like, hey, like here's like the messy parts and here's what you have to know. How do you avoid that? So everything that comes after, like how do you avoid that crazy point? I think for me now, that's where all my energy goes. I think it's around how can I keep this code base and this project really fun to work on for years and years and years. And that doesn't mean getting everything right up front. It means like doing certain things that just give you a lot of options later when you do need to make changes.
Yeah. What about you, Frank?
I think that makes sense from like the past product we built, right? It's you often get this feeling of when you work on like a new project, we have to context switch back to the old project. You're like, oh my goodness, and let me and to refresh my brain of like how does each part connect to each other,
Yeah,
kind
sort
of
of this.
like what Dax described.
Yeah, that's sort of the state of like where you're working with something that that has a bunch of hacks in it, right? It's basically like like you have like scripts here, you've got scripts there, you've got a README here that tells you how to do certain things, and
Yeah. And I think it's funny because a lot of this stuff, some of this is like our new problems, but a lot of this is solved many times over already. It's just you might not necessarily have the exposure to it, or until you have experienced the pain, it kind of sounds like unnecessary or overcomplicated. Like even for me, there was a period of time where, so before Supabase came out, I effectively built something similar to it where it's like a single data model everywhere. And I was like, why do I need to separate my data model on the database from the front end data model? If it's all one thing, everything can be real time. I update, everything was just really fast and productive. But after a couple of years of that, these issues show up. And with some of these things, like SST included, whenever a new framework or any new kind of pattern thing comes up, you really can't judge it until there's been a company that's used it for a couple of years, because a lot of these problems hide until a certain point in time and they kind of jump out. And if you weren't aware that was going to happen, you probably didn't build things in a way so that you could like pivot or like get around it. And yeah, like how many of us have worked at companies where we really felt like, oh, I love this code base? I think it's very rare, and it's always because of stuff like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think this it is sort of where it's sort of like stating here that yeah, for most people, they just want to get to prod, right? So they're that is their main sort of focus. And we've been there before, we've been there multiple times. Like you're just not even like, especially from a startup's perspective, where it's like I don't particularly care if if I hit a wall at some point or not. It's like a nice problem to have.
Yeah, you want to get there.
Yeah, you want to get there. It's a nice problem to have. From Frank and my sort of perspective, like we've gotten to a point where you hit the wall, and you're actually stuck there for a little too long. Like it's uncomfortable. And looking back, you're not sure if that was handled differently, would the trajectory of the product and the company would have been different. And this is one of those things that like it doesn't get talked about enough because you only live one life, right? Like you only look at the history that you've had. And so there isn't an alternate sort of universe of like, oh, if things were done differently, you could have handled that crisis a lot better. That said, though, I think a lot of people are going through this with Heroku. I think recently with some of the incidents that they had, the number of people trying to migrate off of there, and of course, just Heroku that's just been the case with Heroku for a little while. Some of these are like very avoidable. Like, obviously, yeah, if you make the mistake once, you shouldn't repeat it, most likely. But, on the flip side, it's like, we do have tools now, and I think we're getting to that point where almost the entire industry is moving towards sort of a managed services model where we do have tools now that you shouldn't be hitting that wall. Like I think to me, Dynamo has been sort of a great example of this, of like given the fact that exists, which again, like 15 years ago, like something like that didn't quite exist. Of course, like, you've got sort of like your own, like you could run a sort of big table type version yourself. You could run Cassandra yourself. You can do all of these things, and those are hard to do, to run them yourself. But of course, there's like if you did have it running, the promise of this exists in that like you wouldn't have to migrate off of it. Now we do have databases, managed databases that, again, like sort of support this notion of you wouldn't have to migrate off of them, and they give you sort of great performance at sort of amazing scale as well. So that's the part that I want to get to next, which is like, which again, there are these options, and there are obviously the sort of big clouds. But before that, I think we have a couple of questions here. I think one of them, I sort of see this here of like, once you hit the migrate part, aren't you going into the same cycle of a similar problem? And does it have something to do with the lifespan of the product? This is kind of interesting, and maybe Dax, you can kind of talk about this one. But typically, what I've seen with startups is when they hit this migrate wall, and they're usually migrating off of whatever sort of platform, easy to use platform, to a bigger cloud. And I don't think this is the best way to sort of phrase it, but it is an unfortunate way to sort of phrase it. It's typically like the company brings in quote unquote grown-ups.
Yeah.
And it's like, hey, we're going to do it, again, the grown-up way. Like I don't necessarily think that is the best way to sort of phrase this, but that is literally the feeling. And again, like maybe if you're in the company, you might be like, we've got a bunch of suits. The suits are telling us what to do, and you might be unhappy with that. But there is a little bit of that, and maybe you can sort of talk to that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Most companies go through this, and most companies exist, and a lot of companies are successful. The last company I was at started on Heroku, went through exactly what Jay described. Like there's a period where that hit a limit and they didn't move to AWS. hired some people to do that. Big, painful process, and expensive, but it was fine because they, raised millions and millions of dollars and were a hot company. And they'll continue most likely to be a unicorn. Like, there's no reason that this wouldn't be a successful thing. But if you talk to the CTO there, the next company he starts, is he going to do that again? No, definitely not. He's just going to start at a further point from the beginning. And that's kind of the proof around all this. If this process was ideal and perfect and made sense, you would see people repeating it over and over. So that kind of goes to show, like, it's not necessary that you follow the absolute most simple option at the beginning, because people tend not to do that more than once. The other thing with the cycles is, and I think a few other questions comment on this as well. Like, this stuff isn't permanent. You're always going to need to be refactoring and making changes. But it comes down to do you have like a long period of stability where you don't need to do much, and then all of a sudden a huge disruption, then reset a long period of stability, and then a huge disruption. This is like a really tired thing, but I'm still going to bring it up anyway. The idea is, like, imagine you're walking out of your house every single day and you trip from a 1 foot step every single day. That's annoying, right? But whatever, it's like, doesn't hurt that much and you go out through your day. That's different than never tripping for 100 days and then one day falling 100 feet, right? So the idea is, it's kind of better to have like constant refactoring and constant stuff that's like a little chaotic versus massive stability, which usually comes, you're exposing yourself to some kind of crazy moment where things really get more extreme than maybe you can handle. And sometimes companies get permanently changed at that point. Like, it goes from being a fun company to work at to it seeps into all parts of the company. Like, if there's issues in the code base, the team is not shipping as much, the rest of the organization is stressed. When the rest of the organization is stressed, they start to try to intervene with solutions. Some of those end up being things that affect the culture permanently, like, hiring more managers, or like, hiring more people in general just to compensate for this stuff. And it all works, and like, companies go on and it's fine, but it's all avoidable. Like, we can create better companies and we can create better ways to work.
Yeah, and this is the point I was making, I think, with like this. I think the scenario you're sort of describing is sort of a successful scenario. I think Frank and I have been through maybe a not so successful scenario, and it is a thing that, like, I think back to. I'm not sure, like, Frank, how he sort of looks at it, but I think back to it and I go, yeah, I wonder, like, if we weren't dealing with all the sort of scaling issues back then, would we have just iterated on the product faster while we had sort of this crazy sort of period of growth? And would that have like meaningfully changed the trajectory of the company and the product? And there's like a like it's not like a no-brainer thing where, like, yeah, it wouldn't have mattered. I think it might have mattered, and there's no way for me to tell now looking back on it, but like, that is definitely sort of a scenario. Yeah, I don't know how you feel about that one, Frank, when you look, because I think primarily you were going through a lot of this. So
yeah, I mean, I think there is this like cycles where you would go through and then refactor stuff, but I think it's like in terms of levels, right? I still feel you have like follow like the domain driven design and you have like good foundation. So refactoring and re-implementing something is always a scope to like a very
it's like
small,
isolated, right?
Yeah, it's like a lot more fun to work with. Yeah. I think the worst type of like things I would go through is, I do I think essentially, like, if using the framework that's, and this is not part of the fault of the framework, but in terms of like the design and I mean, framework does help like quite a bit, but if everything's like interleaved together and every change is like touching like a bunch of other stuff, right, you would just get really like reluctant on implementing certain features, right? Feature need to be asked by certain X number of customers before you're like, all right, okay, let me go fix it or let me go implement it. Where if things are like very, very scoped to like a very small scope, then you'd be like, all right, that would take me 10 minutes to do.
Yeah. This reminds me of another thing too. Like I think people always think we're talking about scaling, like, oh, you're getting a lot of traffic or a lot of volume, and that's what we're talking about when you hit these walls. And I think oftentimes that is the case, but oftentimes that's not the case. And I think I see the argument of why are you optimizing for scale that 1% of companies will have. But when I say scale, I think more of just complexity. Like the more people you're serving, the more requests from them are coming in, the more features you have in your app, the more they're interacting with other features. But if you have 2 features, that's one feature interacting with another. If you have 10 features, that's that's like 10 times 10, like the interactions, and it just gets exponentially more complicated. And then making like a change in that system is a lot harder than making a change in a smaller system. And I think there's a lot of this goes to if you only ever worked at places that have had these problems, you kind of assume that that's just what the job is. As the company gets older and the product gets bigger, things get harder. But you can actually build things in a certain way where it's easier to ship a feature in year 2 of the company than it was in month 1. That's like completely possible if that's what if you're like aware that's a problem you want to make sure you solve. It's definitely solvable.
Yeah. It's like if you're intentional about that, you could do it better. But before I move forward, I think there are a couple of things in these questions that I want to touch on. One of them, like that is just sort of brought up here, is like what is sort of good enough. Like the technology landscape sort of changes. I think the thing that I want to sort of point out with this graph is that the hacks phase, or those little bumps, that's very different. Like say a migration from, like in this case you're sort of talking about like jQuery, from jQuery to whatever you want to sort of use, the React flavor of, or sorry, not React, but the JavaScript framework flavor of the month that you wanted to move to. That's very different from when you're forced to move off of like the underlying platform that your application is deployed on. And the difference here is that, it's sort of like the way I'm trying to illustrate is like there's bumps and there's like a wall, which is basically like some things are obviously like a little bit harder than others, but there's this one fundamental one that is just a lot harder, which like resets your entire your setup. And that's the one that I have multiple perspectives on. This one we've already sort of touched on, which is as a part of the company that is sort of like using one of these platforms, when you're sort of forced to migrate off of them. In sort of the Paris Heroku world, it was again cost or sort of scaling, or like specific services that they just don't offer, and you just have to like get off of there. Like the Next.js example that we saw sort of yesterday was like cron jobs. It could be something as trivial as that, and it could be something a lot harder, where it's just like, oh, wait a minute, I can't hack my way around this anymore. I actually have to rewrite this somewhere else. That's really, really painful. And if that hits at sort of the wrong spot in your product development cycle or your company's cycle, it can be really, really bad. The second part of this that I want to sort of touch on is actually the flip side, which is from the side of the companies that are building these platforms. And I think being in sort of the startup world and in the ecosystem for a little bit, and interacting with obviously the investor community quite a bit as well, this is I think over the last few years, investors, companies, sort of founders have gotten smart about this as well, is that you can basically bucket application platforms into these two things. Is it the one that you are going to migrate off of at some point, or is it the one that you're not going to migrate off of? And there's now sort of a divide within sort of the VC world of like, hey, we typically only make bets in the infrastructure space in companies that you don't have to migrate off of, versus the ones that you kind of do because they've been bitten. Sort of, so you can almost think about it as like there are users of these companies that have been bitten by them, and they have sort of changed over time, right? Like Parse is not around anymore, and the way things are going with Heroku, I don't know if it will be. And on the flip side of like people that have invested in these companies have also been bitten by the promise of, hey, we're going to get large enough where this is going to be a public company, and they never do, because again, their customers never get that large either, right? So there's like a fundamental cap on how big of a customer these platforms can sort of support. And of course, that relates back to how big the platform itself can get to. And again, like, when you sort of go up the ladders, and this is the next one we're going to look at AWS, is you look at sort of the big clouds. There are obviously companies out there that just cannot live on a big cloud. If you've sort of looked at the news on, or you've sort of heard about, how much so-and-so company is paying AWS or GCP, and it's like it's $1 billion bill. And these things obviously happen because there is a cap to these clouds as well. A famous sort of case being sort of Dropbox, where they decide to completely move off of the cloud and do everything themselves. That's a different scale of a migration. I'm not actually putting it on the graph here, but that is also sort of worth mentioning. This one, though, falls under the category of, at least I personally, and again, there are probably folks that are going to chime in here that are going to think differently, but I put this under the category of that might be a premature optimization. I don't know how many of us are going to be building products or services or companies that are going to be bigger than what AWS can support. So I'm personally not going to touch on that in this conversation, but I can totally see, sort of people sort of thinking otherwise. Let me just turn this on. Okay. So the AWS case in my mind, and in this case, I'm just looking at AWS with serverless. What I'm trying to illustrate here is, take SSD out of the picture. Yeah, and it's not that I'm putting SSD on there just because obviously we're working on it, but more so just if I rewind maybe 2 years back when, like Frank and I, like our sort of personal story, we've built Seed. Seed helps you sort of deploy serverless framework applications, sort of git push to deploy for serverless framework applications to your AWS account. We've been using serverless framework internally. We've looked at all the sort of different tools out there. But not only that, we've worked with teams that have gone from early stages of using sort of serverless to getting it into production and then using it in production for a couple of years. So we've seen this journey firsthand. And then we also saw this journey, ironically, with when Dax was sort of going through this. And he was going through this with SST being around. So again, like I'm not trying to paint a too rosy of a picture here. But the way I kind of look at this is this. The starting point, the total amount of effort sort of required just to get started with the AWS serverless ecosystem is way, way, way higher than the Heroku, Superbases, Parses, obviously XParse of the world. Just from starting with, you need your own account, you need a credit card, you need to understand IAM. Just getting out of the gates is just a lot harder. The learning curve is also quite high. So the amount of work it takes to just sort of learn it and then getting down to, I'm laughing at the comments, getting down to a point where you're just operating is like way higher. Like the way I would sort of phrase this is, with a lot of the other platforms, the sort of Superbases or Next.js's of the world, their getting started guide, which is the learning curve, gets you to a point where you are now operating just day to day. And that could go literally from something that would take you 30 minutes to maybe a couple of hours. Whereas the serverless world, the getting started guide, like, we wrote the guide in many ways, is like a weekend's worth of work rather, and it doesn't stop there. Like so if I was sort of illustrate this, I don't know if you guys can see can you see my mouse, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay. So I would sort of look at this as like, it takes a ton of work to even get to a point where you have it running locally. And then you start hitting these bumps of like, oh, how do I do auth in serverless or in AWS, right? Like, how do I upload files? And so you have these constant bumps before you even get your thing into production. And again, like the way sort of the frameworks of the world, I'll put SSD in there, like serverless framework, SSD, SAM, all of those, they make it appear at the beginning stages, at the sort of learning curve stage, that all it takes is 3 commands and 5 lines of YAML. It looks almost exactly, or not exactly, but very similar to what it's like with any of the other easy to get started sort of products or platforms of the world. But obviously that's not true. The moment you even like deploy the thing, you have an immediate next question of like, how do I do X? And that how do I do X requires you to go Google something. The reason why our guide, when we had launched it in 2017, was fairly popular was because it took a lot of those bumps and put it all together into a non-trivial 300-page ebook, right? It's like, if you sat through it, we could get you through every single one of those bumps, and you have like a CRUD app with authentication and file uploads now deployed and live in production with a custom domain. um, and each one of those bumps was basically what's being packaged into our guide. But before I get to prod, I want to sort of pause here, because I've watched sort of Dax go through this. We've obviously seen a bunch of other people as well, but it's almost like this really weird process of, okay, cool, I have an endpoint in production. I did that. That was easy. But how do I do X in serverless? Or how do I do X in AWS? And it takes you to answer a few of those. And it feels honestly like a few weeks to maybe a month worth of work before you feel confident enough to be like, you know what, I can use this at work. Maybe Dax, maybe you want to sort of speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm recalling, I was just looking at this yesterday, and I was laughing to myself because, so I had an app I wanted to build like 2 years ago, I guess now it was, and I initially built a pretty complete version of it in like a week with Elixir and like a bunch of stuff I was very familiar with. And then I made a branch called Experiment, and I rewrote it in. So I was like, let me learn all the serverless AWS stuff, and I rewrote it in. I tried to rewrite it with SST and all the serverless stuff. And in that process, this was like 2 years ago, I like kept deviating because I kept learning other stuff. I was like, oh, I have to learn about Cognito. I have to learn about Dynamo. I have to learn about whatever. It's been 2 years, and that branch is still called Experiment, and everything that was in there from when I was working on it is actually not right. Like, I didn't do a lot of this stuff right, and the app does not perform well, and there's a bunch of issues with it. So that was me in a pretty unique situation. I was able to like spend a good amount of time just thinking and working on this. And like, I have like a decent amount of experience too. Like, I'm not that new to building apps in general. And even then, like, what I put together was pretty bad. Like it's like not a good app. I think a few years later now, if I were to do that, like, yes, now I could like ship something that's good. But the cost and the bumps and all that stuff is really unbelievable. Like, it's actually been nothing like anything else I've done in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, Frank, does that part sort of make sense to you? Like the learning experience? I guess this is like if you were to recommend this to a friend, like this is kind of what they're going to go through before they even get into prod.
Yeah. I think, to be fair, right now, right, for a certain type of project, right, especially side project or toy project, right, if my friends come to me and be like, what should I use? I would think twice before recommending SST, right? Just given how much of the underlying knowledge you need to learn. I for certain type of things, I think Next plus Superbase is like way more smooth.
Yeah, and I think that is the one that I sort of want to highlight. But let me go through the rest of this rest of the trajectory here, because this is the part that like I personally feel a little guilty about. So sort of recap here, really sort of steep learning curve. most people don't even get that far, right? Like they just like look at the list of things that you kind of need to do, and again, like, you know, if you don't find our guide, or if you don't find some other sort of resources, like, you basically don't do this. The only people that I honestly see going through the learning curve are because they're trying to get like an AWS certification or something. Like they're like, it's actually their job to go out and learn how to do this. But otherwise they just don't get through it. And I'm just talking about the learning curve. I'm not even talking about the rest of the parts of like getting the different sort of aspects of your application figured out before you get into production. But after you get there, like, the way I sort of see this is like a bunch of people just drop off at the learning curve stage, and then at every single point of this, you're just losing a bunch of people. So, you know, right now, like, we're trying to figure out sort of what is the best way to kind of do auth. I'm picking on auth because auth ends up being sort of linchpin for a lot of these things, and it is incredibly complicated. But there's things like testing. It comes up all the time where people are like, hey, I'm coming in from XYZ background. This is how I used to do tests. How do I do it in serverless? And to this day, there isn't a good explanation of this anywhere, like literally anywhere. And so you'll think about it this way. Like, if you've got sort of a potential CTO at a startup, or, you know, even within sort of a larger company, a sort of tech lead thinking about greenfield project, and they're potentially evaluating stuff, they have to go through this process of basically figuring out all these things that they knew how to do in their previous frameworks, or in a non-serverless sort of context, in the serverless context all over again. It's like learning to walk all over again. And literally, like, it's like going from one Google query to another, or one sort of Slack or Discord message to another. And I don't know about you guys, but like, I sort of see this like time and time again, even within obviously our community as well, but like any other community, where it's like Groundhog Day, right? Like, everybody's sort of doing the exact same sets of things. Like, they're asking the exact same sets of questions. And it is painful to kind of watch, right?
Yeah.
I'm just sort of looking at the questions here. The next part of it that I want to look at is when you actually get into prod. And like, sadly, it doesn't sort of stop there. So once you get into prod, I think the good part with serverless and AWS obviously is that, like, if you've set stuff up reasonably well, and I think there is a bit of an if there, if you've set stuff up reasonably well, then scaling isn't as much of an issue. It can be, again, like, if things aren't necessarily configured well, like, again, like, yeah, maybe you haven't designed your DynamoDB tables well, or like, yeah, I don't know, like, you're calling your Lambda functions with the Lambda functions, or whatever it is. It's like, you could still run into sort of scaling issues, but let's just assume for now that, like, on a certain level, that is kind of handled, and again, cost is sort of under control as well. You still end up sort of running into bumps. So, for example, you know, the big one that comes out after you go into production is observability. It's like, hey, I'm getting these errors, or more likely, it's like my users are reporting errors and I don't know where they're coming from. My logs aren't, like, I'm looking at a bunch of different logs. I don't have a clear picture of the whole thing. And this is a good reason why there are, you know, half a dozen observability providers in the serverless space, is because, again, like, that is a fundamental concern that you hit. The reason I have, so I sort of go back here, the reason I want to talk about this in the context of things that happen after prod is because you're almost locked into it at this point. So this ends up, like, especially I'm picking on observability here, but it ends up becoming a useful space for companies to then build supporting services on, is because the sets of users or companies that are running into serverless operational issues have already committed into it on a level where they're obviously willing to pay. And you know, that makes for a good customer base. You know, there are a bunch of people that have issues up here pre-prod, but that isn't an attractive customer base because they haven't decided if they want to spend on it just yet or not. But once you're here, it's like, okay, now I have this in production. I actually have live users. I'm making, money or whatever it is. And we need this sort of fixed. Otherwise, again, we're going to be slapped with a big wall of having to migrate off of it. And a lot of people obviously don't want to do that right away. And so my sort of point being that, like, even past prod, I feel like companies run into issues, teams run into issues similar to, again, pre-prod of like, hey, I used to do this a certain way before, and I don't quite know how to do that now in the serverless context, or the tooling isn't quite available in the serverless context, and they're trying to figure out how to kind of like do stuff. Before I sort of pause, the one thing I want to sort of point out with this one that is sort of worth mentioning is that in this sort of post-prod scenario, if you look at most of the serverless feedback surveys, like these are just like, hey, what are the big issues that you're sort of running into? You typically see these. It's because we are surveying the people that have been selected that are actually staying in the serverless ecosystem, right? Like most of the concerns that people have are typically post-prod in some ways. Yeah, there are obviously people that are like, yeah, it's complicated, it's hard to get started, but you're actually not surveying the bucket of people that did not choose to go into prod with serverless. And so anyway, so that's sort of what I kind of feel is the trajectory of like current AWS serverless usage. But I don't know if you guys wanted to add something to that.
Yeah, that's an interesting point with the pre-prod and post-prod. Like, yeah, I never thought about it that way, where there's just people dropping off at like the beginning of the funnel. And I think most of the discussions and the energy and the attention goes to people that have made it past that point. And yeah, like we can spend a ton of resources there, but doesn't necessarily grow the number of people that are using this architecture that much. And I think we've seen that because all this stuff has been possible for a while, and like, to different degrees, but it hasn't really grown that much. Like how many companies are actually building the way that we build stuff? Like, I don't know, like I would guess like 1 in 100, I feel like, if that.
And all the problems people run into post-prod, the solutions can be very similar to non-serverless setups, right? Like what you imagine, like observability dashboard, and you actually want that to look very similar to your.
Right.
I never use Kubernetes, but assume you have something similar, right? Or Ruby on Rails type of dashboard, right? If you want, I think what's that for? Like let's say data lake solutions. Right? I'm just throwing
like blue green, right? Yeah.
The blue green is slightly different, right? That's actually like people might want that slightly easy earlier, but it actually needs a ground up solution. That's why there is no out of box blue green solution for serverless, right? For other solutions out there are to help post prod, and the solution themselves aren't necessarily you need to re-engineering them, right? But the problem like local development, right? How to have a local environment, like how to do blue green, and a lot of these things, it actually like very specific to serverless, and you might run into them very early on, and they're not being solved because you need to come up with like a new solution. Also, it might not, financially might not make sense for companies. I think those two reasons add up.
Yeah. And then there's the other part of this of like the sort of selection bias thing, which is, and it confused the hell out of me for a really long time as well, is that like we've been in the serverless community for a really long time, and I just couldn't understand why the conversations never sort of, it's again, never might be a strong word, but like it didn't center around, hey, it's just really hard to get a decent app into production. It always sort of centered around like a little bit more hand wavy, sort of higher order, more complicated issues. And there's a good reason for this. Is because the people that are left in the pot of serverless developers are people that have made it that far to begin with. And we have this thing. I don't know what the sort of official term for this is, but let's call it like developer amnesia. Like once you have the thing sort of working, you immediately forget the work to get yourself there. And you're just and when you explain to somebody else, you're like, yeah, it's fine, you'll figure it out. You're like, and you completely forget the amount of time that you had spent, sort of getting yourself there. But yeah.
If I reflect on that and like just looking at the code I wrote from like when I was like 1 or 2 months into this, I'm like, oh yeah, there's so much stuff that I was so confused about. That you just don't remember, and you like stop caring to some degree because you're like, thank God I'm out of that phase.
Yeah. You're not going to do that. You're not going to go through that again. Right. But B, it's like you actually don't want to. So I think maybe you are actively trying to block that part from your memory. The final thing I wanted to sort of touch on before I compare these two sort of curves here is that on a personal level, and this may or may not be shocking to people in the community, on a personal level, like Frank already sort of said this, it's like if a friend came in and they were like, hey, I have sort of weekend project, or even sort of startup idea, and it's like, should I use serverless for it? I used to be hesitant for two reasons, and they sort of neatly fit into this graph. So the first reason is the obvious, which is just to get them into production, there's so much work that need to sort of go through, and that's obviously why we created the guide. We were like, hey, if you're able to sit through the guide, you're able to go through the whole thing, great, you have it in production. I feel like I've given you something that answers a lot of those questions. But again, like not everybody sort of sits through the whole guide, and it is quite a bit of work, and it doesn't maybe again like answer it to the depth that I am totally satisfied with, and part of it has to do with obviously like writing, but a lot of it also has to do just with the underlying sort of technology. The second reason why I'm iffy about recommending it to a lot of people is actually the post-prod part. And the big reason for this is now the consequences of your mistakes are real, which is, pre-prod, the worst you could do is you've fucked up or you've like messed up sort of a week's worth of work. You just move on and you use whatever you're sort of familiar with. And you just like abandon what you're sort of put together, maybe like what sort of Dax is saying here. But the post-prod part, when they come to you with a question, it's because their site is down. And then you actually have to answer this question. I'm sure Frank has had a ton of this where it's like, anytime you've made a recommendation to a friend, there is this like personal feeling of guilt.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're now like partly responsible for that recommendation. Like this is not like sort of the thought leadery, 140 character or whatever tweet. This is like you've actually told your friend this is what you should do, or he or she should do, and when they run into trouble, like you're sort of responsible for it. I'm sure you guys have been in that situation, but I'll sort of pause there for a second.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've gone through that enough times where now I'm like pretty cautious about. I mean, I still get excited about stuff, and I definitely make recommendations, but yeah, I feel like this bleeds over into all parts of my life. Like if someone is like, "Oh, like, do you know a good dentist?" Like I never make recommendations ever because I'm like, it's not up to me whether the dentist does a good job or not. So like, I don't want to feel like I led them the wrong way. And I feel like that shows up in our framework too, and in a lot of when people ask us questions. There's some stuff I'm pretty like hardline on, but there's a lot of stuff where I'm like, well, if you want to do it like this, then you can do that. But if you want to do it like that, then you would have to do it like this. So I feel like I want to always make it. I'll like help them clarify their decision, but I want to like still feel like I give them information they needed to make their own decision.
Yeah. Anything to add there, Frank?
No, it's good.
The pre-prod, post-prod part is the comparison that I want to make between these two. So the easy to get started platforms out there have just so heavily focused on on the pre-prod part. And there's a good reason for this, because historically, most of the complexity is just in that. So if you just look at sort of the AWS serverless approach, and you could replace sort of AWS serverless with, like Kubernetes, you could replace it with a bunch of different, even like the so-called sort of easy to get started things of the past generation kind of fall under this bucket as well now. And there's been a ton of focus on just bringing and smoothing that sort of process out to the point that with a very sort of simple quick start, and really well put together documentation and examples, you should be able to get into production. So the way I kind of think about the ecosystem in many ways is every new iteration of an easy to get started platform is basically, as I sort of was tongue-in-cheek calling it race to the bottom, but race to the bottom in the sense of this graph, which is keep lowering the effort it takes to sort of get started, and smooth out the learning curve, to the point that you can get people into prod. Um, and obviously, even within the serverless world, that's what a lot of folks are trying to do. It's like, how can we smooth out the pre-prod part of it? And again, I keep stressing the pre-prod part is because that's the general mindset that a lot of people have, in that you have this aha experience once your stuff is in prod and people are using it. But there's also this other part, and this is, maybe not intentional, but unfortunately it is a side effect, is that once you're in prod, you are sort of locked in to using the current solution that you've chosen, right? You could have, so like right before your stuff is in production, when you're still experimenting, the only thing that you lose is the time that you have spent experimenting. Once you're in production, what you lose is potentially users and potentially revenue. And the side effect of just focusing on making something easy to get started is basically this, like the prod barrier of like, we can ignore some of the issues that come in after prod. And what I'm trying to sort of communicate here is that, one of the biggest reasons why I'm afraid of wholeheartedly sort of recommending serverless to a lot of people in my life is actually not so much so the pre-prod part. The pre-prod part is hard. I sort of get that. We've written guides on that. It's actually the post-prod part, which is when things really matter. And for varying reasons, if you sort of look at these two sort of options here, on one hand, if you're going to be building something that is going to hit some amount of scale, and you might not, and you might know that up front. So say, for example, you're working on a marketing project at an agency, and the shelf life of the entire project, the total amount of traffic that it has to handle, and that the sort of platform that you're going with is going to be able to handle it. You don't have to worry about the post-prod part as much. But if that is not the case, like in our case, mostly the people that are at least in my life, and the people that are in our community are looking to build sort of like startups and significant projects within sort of larger companies. For those folks, the post-prod part really, really sort of matters. And if I compare these two options for different reasons, they are both hard. There's one obvious one with the easy to get started one, which is that you actually hit a wall, and hitting the migration wall effectively means that you have to sort of rethink all of your choices from scratch. It's not that extreme in the case of the sort of AWS or the serverless world. You can throw money at the problem, and the money is a little bit lesser than the migration case, like kind of like what Dax was sort of talking about before. You can get in AWS sort of consultants and re-architect some of your stuff. You can buy services out there, observability, like we sort of talked about, that'll fix some of your problems. But again, the point I'm trying to get across is that I think there is undue amount of attention being put towards the easy to get started section. This is the pre-prod section, and maybe not enough in the post-prod one. Partly because you're sort of locked in, but also because it's like maybe it doesn't show up front. Dax, I don't know if you've got some ideas on, I guess the question to you is like, why do you think there's so much of an attention towards the easy to get startedness of most of these platforms?
Yeah, I think maybe my view is a little more cynical. I feel like with every project, you need to grow it. Like you want to see the numbers go up. You want to, like you need that's like the reason you're doing it, and how you like continue to be able to do it. And I think it's that approach of look at 3 lines and your whole app is up. It works because, like I said, I think a lot of people want that. They want to feel like they made the choice and it's a good choice and it's going to solve all their problems. And I think there's like feedback loop of it's just like it's like a contest. Someone will show off how easy something is, and as soon as one project does that, it implicitly is implying all these other ones are too hard to, like, you're not going to be able to even ship your app. So everyone kind of needs to go meet them at that place. And I think when you start to get into that cycle, you forget that you're actually, the easiest way to make something easier to get started is by trading off long-term maintainability. It doesn't have to be that way, but it's usually the easiest thing to do. Like just do more stuff automatically, or like make more assumptions, or narrow your scope of what you support. These tend to be the easiest things to make things look easier to get started. So I think it's like kind of the default thing. If you want to promote your project, like what's your angle? Like, well, how do you explain it to people? Look how easy to get started is the first thing everyone thinks about. And it's kind of harder to sell people, I think, on, yeah, I know this looks a little bit harder than other stuff, but trust me, eventually you'll appreciate it. The one, they have to believe you. Two, I think they kind of have had to have gone through the pain already to even know what you're talking about. So yeah, like there's just like a certain like incentive structure or like thing that exists that kind of draws everyone to really focusing on the ease of beginning a project.
I guess it's also that like that is the thing that's most visible.
Yeah, it's where people start. They start with the getting started guide. So if they don't have a great experience with that, then it might drop off.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like sometimes I wish I could we have some really great companies doing some cool things, and maybe there's a way to do this, but like I wish that was the most visible thing. Like, wow, like, look how good this product is. By the way, they built this with SST. Or like, look at this like crazy problem they're solving. By the way, they're using SST. That's actually probably what I care about. But yeah, it's kind of, I think, hard to pull that off. You have to wait till people actually, go through a few years of building something to be able to show off those valuable things they built.
Yeah, again, it's a combination, at least a longer term thing, which will like switching to that a bit more. But I think Frank had sort of touched on this one. It's like it's a combination of like, like the domain-driven design stuff, like design patterns plus the framework. It's not just a framework on its own, but there are some things that the easy to get started frameworks just like prohibitively prevent you from doing, and so anything to add, Frank?
Yeah, I think there's a question early on, right? We're saying, does it have to be easy to start, or, customizability? Yeah, no, to a certain degree, I think yes, right.
Yeah, so the guiding principle, and I kind of wrote about this in our, like, we have a design principles sort of doc, and that needs to be refreshed. But the point I was trying to make there, and this is the lens that I view every single sort of like SST feature through, is, and we'll switch to the SST part of it. And I think this is more of an open discussion in terms of like what we're trying to do. But the easy to use versus customizability thing, for me, the key thing has always been, it should be like easy to use in the sense that like when you look at it, it's like it's something I can like grok and understand relatively easily. But in this case, it's like the constructs, they should be completely customizable. And for us, it's like it's sort of levels of customizability. Eventually, it just ends up in like, hey, we support, we're built on CDK, so you can just like you can give us the underlying sort of CDK thing. So you're not sort of locked in with what we're kind of doing. And that final like CDK bit, for some people, it might be peace of mind. For other people, it might be a necessity. Like they need to see this to be able to adopt SSD. And to be fair, I think a lot of folks picked SSD early on, even when we were very early in our life cycle, mainly because, like, again, it was sort of built on CDK. Like, that you're not locked into our way of doing things. So when I go back to sort of question of like easy to use versus customizability, I don't think we'll ever build something that doesn't let you customize it sort of all the way through or have alternative options. So a good example of this is maybe the auth thing that we're about to ship. There's like a way to sort of customize it. However, if you need something way past it, you can still, again, just like use whatever sort of CDK or AWS sort of provides. So the point there being, that in itself might not be completely customizable till the end, and it might sort of like we might improve that over time, but there's always going to be an alternative option that like your sort of like do it yourself option that still works within the rest of the SSD ecosystem. Yeah.
Yeah, I think if I think about like very specific things, there's a whole set of things that I probably could make nicer if I drop the constraint of supporting CDK. Like the fact that we're choosing to support CDK and it's a constraint that we're making, it does like put a limit on certain like we can't solve certain problems because of that. But we're never going to get so obsessed with making things feel easier where we compromise on like pretty significant capabilities, like being able to use any CDK construct, being able to disagree with our design patterns. Like I think that's where I think a lot of these other frameworks have an advantage, where they're kind of building in their own isolated way, and it's kind of like do things our way exactly, or it actually doesn't work. Yeah, you are going to get to a lower place on this chart, which we're never going to get to. But yeah, I think that's hopefully our angle, which is like we want to be ejection free. Like we don't want anyone to ever eject from presuming like you use SC and you genuinely like it. I don't see a reason why one day you'd have to completely eject out of it. That's like the larger thing for me, where I think with some of these other things, like they actually don't worry about that as much because they're really focused on a different part of this life cycle.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's an hour and 12 minutes. I think that covers the intro. Now let's get to the fun part. All right, Dax. All right, to start with, okay. So what you said yesterday was, hey, maybe we should not be thinking about the easy to get started part as much. I don't know if you maybe you want to like restate your kind of like your argument from yesterday.
Yeah, I think the thing that I said earlier is there's like this natural, because of the things that are out there, which is the way other companies market themselves, the way developers compare things, and just given the amount of noise, there's like a natural draw to feel like you have to be the easiest thing to use. When someone lands on your site, it has to look like this is like the easiest thing possible. I think there's like a natural pull. So my thinking was, if we do nothing, we're going to kind of naturally do that because that's just the way everything gets pushed. And I think in our situation, we're actually never going to win that battle because of the other goals that we also have. So I think it makes sense for us to take inspiration from these other projects to try to always make our stuff easier and like look at like great DX somewhere else and be like, we should be more like that. That makes sense. But from a marketing angle, we're actually never going to win that argument. So I was wondering, what if we like just took a completely different angle? I don't know what that angle is, but what if we like gave up on selling that at all and just like doubled down on some other way to message?
Yeah. Yeah, Frank, anything you wanted to say? It sounded like you had something to say there.
Yeah, I'm just thinking. You go on. I think it makes sense. Yeah, I think what you guys are saying, easy to get started.
Yeah, I think so. So the way I was trying to draw this out, let me sort of do this one here. Is like where what would make sense, like if I thought about what SSD would sort of be like, and um like first things first, it's again just starting right at the beginning. It should be easier, obviously, to get started than if you were just doing sort of serverless on your own, or using one of the existing sort of frameworks or AWS on your own. Um, it should have an easier learning curve. We should be able to bake a lot of the AWS best practices into our constructs so that out of the box, we're able to make and obviously bake in these recommendations that you don't have to think about upfront. We do sort of, again, like IAM roles, we do all sort of the permissioning in a way that you don't have to think about, like, creating like these policies or creating like an administrator policy. Um, we should sort of prevent you from having to do a bunch of Googling to figure out, am I doing things the right way? And removing that fear fundamentally, which a lot of people, when they do AWS, have, which is, I don't know if I'm actually setting it up right. And so I'm not confident if I can get into prod. I don't know if you guys have sort of seen this, but recently I started sort of noticing this trend of startups specifically, where they felt like an AWS solutions architect hire needed to be one of their first 5 hires. Essentially, like the peace of mind of, hey, I am doing it in the AWS prescribed way, and so we are okay to go into production. We want to remove that. So that's sort of like our stated goal up front, which is when we create a construct, and this is very separate from CDK's constructs. When we create a construct, we're actively thinking, does this make sense for our audience? Again, granted, it doesn't make sense for everybody, but for majority of the people, why wouldn't they want to do it this way? I think we have actually a recent example of this that sort of Frank ran into, which is this, like, the SES case. Um, and Frank, maybe you can sort of share more on this one, but it's like a typical example of, like, hey, why isn't this built into this? Like, isn't this obvious that it should be built into the construct itself? But obviously it isn't.
Yeah. Yesterday, I just ran into an issue where all of a sudden, I think all the outgoing emails stopped sending and went to the console. And like, oh, like they paused our sending ability. The reason was that X percentage of our emails were being bounced, and they're trying to protect their outgoing server reputation. They have to turn us off. And I'm looking, okay, how do I resolve this? It's like, oh, you need to set up an SNS topic so SES can notify that SNS topic when there's an email being bounced. And then you need to have a Lambda function subscribe to the topic. And then from the event object, you can figure out what the two email address is. And then you can add this two email address to SES, they call it like suppression list. So like pretty much just like, don't send to this person. And I'm like, that is such basic loop, and it's like well-defined like issue. Like you would just imagine if you were using like MailChimp or anything, like it should be out of box. Shouldn't even be like so impressive. This is like, we have this feature. This is almost like given that you should just handle this out of the box. And to get around that, I actually have to create like a new stack in my SSD app, create a topic, there's a bunch of stuff, and then to deploy this. I just thought it would be something that's handled out of the box. Yeah.
Yeah, so that sort of covers, I think, like the first part of it. Let me try and like put this out here. So when I look at the learning curve, like just the initial part of the learning curve, that is the thing I think about with what we're doing with our constructs currently. This is uh, we make most of the best practice sort of choices and bake that into the construct out of the box. Um, in addition to that, we obviously do things like I'll pick on like sort of custom domains with our API construct or the static site construct. It's like, again, like pretty simply done out of the box. Other folks sort of do this as well, but again, that is like the almost like the price of entry for making things easier in sort of the serverless world. The second part of it, and this is the one which is like the bumps that you go through before you get into production. These are, hey, I'm coming in from this background. How do I do secrets? How do I do auth? How do I do environment variables, whatever? How do I do sort of testing? And you go through this like cycle of basically figuring that out, figuring each of those things out for the serverless context. That is a thing that we don't currently do, and that is what we're trying to address with create SST, or like we call it sort of the ideal stack. um, this took a bit of a shift in mindset for us because it touches things outside of just core SST. This requires us to pull and look at and evaluate the other options, just options in the ecosystem, integrate that into sort of this larger setup to answer these questions, so that the starter that you get with us has these answers sort of baked in. And what you need to do is basically write the code necessary to get your app into production. To be very clear, we're not done with this part yet, but that is the part that, at least currently, as a team, we're sort of focused on. Right. So if you guys sort of think about that, it's like the construct piece is trying to smooth out the learning curve for AWS on some level. And then this other piece that we're working on with the ideal stack is to answer the regular, day to day, I guess, concerns that you have even outside of the sort of the serverless ecosystem, and baking that in. Plus having things like the domain driven design approach. So like, how do you organize a sizable project? This is like a very, very common question that comes up. And baking that in a way that you look at that and you go, I can take this to production. Does that make sense to you guys in terms of like where we are?
Yeah, I mean that makes sense, but I think we shouldn't look at this as like easy to get started versus customizability. I think we should look at case by case, right? I was trying to think through the different cases. Okay, one case, for example, for someone who come in assuming they don't have like a lot of AWS knowledge, to use SST. Okay, the concept of an app. Okay, I get that. The concept of a stack. Like, why do I need a stack? It's like, oh, is it like on my? I should have put everything in one service in the stack. Kind of, or like, oh, by the way, stack also have this limit of 500 resources. Oh, by the way, you cannot reference, like when you need to reference something from another stack, it goes to the export. Oh, by the way, if something's importing that, you cannot change the value of the export. You have these like 10 other constraints, plus CloudFormation is like super slow. All of this are like added concept that you need to understand before they get started, which we could take out. Say tomorrow we build out like the equivalent of like Terraform, but
Right.
like fully compatible with CloudFormation template. It's super fast. There's this no concept of a stack. Everything is you just have this one stack, and that will solve that question. If people don't need to understand what a stack is, what like a stack export or stack output, the difference between like how you reference stuff, like we can hide out all that. That we could fix, but takes a lot of work.
Yep.
Right. And there's the other type of things where it's, let's say for Next.js and for some of the other app framework, the way you do secrets is you open up like .in file and then dump your secrets in there. And then when you deploy You need to set up secrets on your CI/CD platform, right? And like the moment you grow a bit larger, it's like, oh, I can't. That's not going to work. I should use like Vault or SSM.
Right.
And if you use SSM, right, it's like you could set it up yourself, but it's a bit of work. But that's something we could. We are already doing that. We should help you like make it easier, right?
Right.
Like you're not dealing with SSM. You're not going to the SSM console. We give you like a CLI, maybe even through SSD console. You have like, oh, here are your secrets. We'll set it, right? We set it on there. It's little effort, and then we give you like the best practice way of doing stuff. It still might, but to people who have never understood why you can like why you shouldn't use like a .in file,
right,
they will feel like, why so much work? Why can't I just use a .in file, right? That's the thing where like we shouldn't be like, all right, let's also support .in file. And let's also support a version where you can commit your .in file to your to-git, right? That would be super easy, but it doesn't really make sense in the long term, right? I think that would be a hard limit of like, we actually can't or we shouldn't be the easiest way to get started, right? And then there's along this line, there is this thing where with like Supabase or parse, where every data model is mapped to like a CRUD API. You don't deal with API anymore, right? Like you create a data model, you can call in your front end, right? Works super well for the first month, but after it's like, oh, I want an API that does two things. So it's a bit trickier.
Yeah.
Right? And should we provide that, knowing that it's not going to be very useful for anyone?
Yep.
That's gonna pass like a month, but just to get them hooked for the first month, right? Should we provide a way of doing that? And I think if we do, that's wrong.
Yep.
Why should we trick people into doing this like database model to API one-to-one mapping, and then later on be like, you should really use GraphQL or give them other options?
Yeah.
So
there's like, that's not right. And on top of that, we're not going to win that either.
Yeah.
I think other people's stuff in that category is going to look better than ours.
Unless we completely change, create SST experience, change our landing page.
Frank.
Product. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, sorry, Frank. If I was to list out those two things you're saying, the first one is like I think the stack limit was a good one, right? It's like we have the stacks concept not because we want to have the stacks concept, but because it's a quirk of AWS, right?
Yeah.
And the second one you're saying is like something like the secrets, where actually we should do a slightly more complicated approach because it is going to work for you better in the long run. Is that what you're roughly trying to say there?
Yeah, I think those three examples are like, one is things we actually could fix, like CloudFormation. In this case, it would be a lot of effort, but in some other cases, it could be a little effort that we could fix to make it very easy to get started. Right. For secrets, it's like very little effort we need to do, relatively speaking, to give you something, and that's slightly more complicated, but the best experience, right? And two people is slightly more effort to implement that, right? It's like a win-win situation for both. But the third one is we something we feel is we shouldn't be providing a simple solution. Right, this is the model to API one-to-one mapping.
Right. Let me just write that down, because I think that this is a pretty this is the good sort of launching point in some ways of like of this discussion. Yeah, Dax, anything else to add before I sort of go into that one?
No, I'm just thinking about this. This makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, so I think this is good. So let me just finish up the rest of this curve. The thing that I'm trying to illustrate in this curve in some ways is that if you compare to the regular sort of AWS serverless journey, every time you go through and you understand, oh, this is how I do secrets, and you have it sort of set up, you hit this point of like, all right, good, I'm comfortable with the setup, I like the setup, until you hit the next road bump, right? Or sort of like roadblock rather. In the case of SST, I think what we would want with the ideal stack, so this is both with the constructs plus the ideal stack put together, we give you that sort of smooth sort of experience. Smooth, again, sort of similar to this level of smooth. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that, sure, it's a little bit more complicated in that if you were to just literally open up like your like VS Code or your file browser, there are a lot more files there than you would see in sort of the sort of standard like a Next.js or like a Supabase sort of setup. And there might be a little bit more sort of like moving parts. But once you start using it, the experience should be smooth because it has answers to the things that you're probably going to have questions for. I'm personally actually feeling this right now. So I'm for the people that might be sort of listening, I'm creating a new version of our tutorial, and I'll be making a new version of our guide using the ideal stack and using like what we're sort of doing with Create SST. And there's the spot that you hit with, and full disclosure, so I haven't used a ton of TypeScript before, I haven't used GraphQL before, so a lot of things that we have in the actual stack are new to me as well. This is literally the process that I'd gone through when I'd written the guide in the first place. That's what I'm going through now, in sort of like this, second, probably the biggest iteration of the guide. But you hit this point, and I'm hitting this now, where it's like, because of autocomplete sort of working really well, because of the editor being aware of like almost every single part of my app, the experience is literally like I'm relying on the tooling that's been provided to make me more productive. So this is a case of like where, and I want to sort of underscore this as well as I can, I'm not fighting the tools anymore. The tools are actually helping me. And there is in this case, and this is the one I want to underscore, I am okay with paying this cost up front, because within a few hours or like a day of having sort of my head wrapped around the initial setup of the ideal stack, I am now in a spot where the tools are so good that they are helping me along. They're not in my way anymore, and that I obviously couldn't have said for sort of like even the other setups that we have. A lot of this again has to do with sort of TypeScript, the end-to-end sort of type safety, the editor integration, all the work that was sort of put into it. But again, that's like worth sort of mentioning here, is that where we want to get to with SST, and again, we're not quite there yet, but where we want to get to SST is a much lower sort of learning curve. You're starting off at a much lower point as well compared to just sort of like your raw AWS experience. And the tools are not in your way. We've answered most of your questions. Again, this is still getting you just getting into prod. And then even past prod, the thing that we want to do is, this is the part that we sort of want, where we were kind of talking about, is that if you're intentional about having a setup and a way that you've organized your projects, plus the framework, in minimizing sort of the day-to-day pain of adding new features, the complexity and the effort should grow linearly, in the sense that like the more stuff there is, that is the about the amount of sort of like effort that you have to sort of put in, and it's not growing exponentially, as in when you add a new feature now, because it has to talk to, like, kind of like what Dax was saying before, now that you add another feature and because it's talking to everything else, now your app is like X times more complex. That shouldn't be the case. And the post-prod stuff, again, this is a little bit further down in our roadmap, and this will fall under the sort of territory of seed and the kind of the newer version of seed that we'll sort of create, is that we want to hit on some of the post-prod issues as well. And again, the final goal kind of being is where we get to a point where we can wholeheartedly sort of recommend this to somebody, in the sense that they can go out and build, $1 billion company on top of it. So that's kind of like the overall goal. To set up the rest of the sort of conversation, I think Frank kind of hit upon this, and this is the one I think like the three of us need to kind of dive in on. Is basically Frank basically sort of said this already. We obviously want to make things easier, but we are never going to take something that is easier, which is going to cause you pain and or like a migration eject point down the road, right? So that's like one of our like core things, I guess. Like I'll kind of like write it down, but what I want to get out of this this meeting and this stream, I guess, is like what are the things that we're saying no to that we won't ever do. What are sort of like kind of like the guiding principles of like both us as sort of a team, but also like from a design perspective when you have to like make choices on like individual constructs or features that we're sort of working on. So let me put this one down first. Yeah, but I'll let you guys sort of add more to it. Okay. So that is the don't do side, which is like we don't want to make a design choice that you have to later eject out of. That instantly has this issue, right? Which is that causes us to pick certain ways of doing things within the AWS ecosystem. So there's like this delicate balance of like, so now we have to, let's just take the CloudFormation one, for example. It's like for now we're tied to CloudFormation. And because we're not going to, and we don't have any other sort of viable options, I guess, let's just ignore sort of Terraform just for a second. But because we don't have other viable options, we have to pick CloudFormation. And so we have to embrace the quirk of the stacks thing.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because we're not going to recommend something to you that eventually is a dead end. Right?
Yeah, unless we can fully invest in writing like alternative, right? We shouldn't write something half-assed that might not work for certain resources that and has to be able to switch.
Yeah, like it wouldn't be hard to build something that just supported our constructs, but that's not good enough because you're going to get stuck somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I look at this curve, it's like you're trying to lower the bar, like make it easier on one side, but it's kind of like the seesaw thing. Like if it's like tilting in the other side, it's actually not worth lowering the bar that much.
Yeah, and there's so many things that I think this is another issue with the focus on making things easy. It kind of feels like that's the only option to make the experience better, but there's usually a lot of other stuff that you can also do. Like if you look at even just the local development setup, that's technically not in the category of like you don't have to know much and you can still ship stuff. It's more around like this is a really painful part of the process that is better. And there's like a bunch of like performance things we can do that genuinely makes the stuff a lot better and a lot easier to work with every single day that I think has more value than just finding some trade-off of long-term versus short-term. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Like some of those, like how can we make deployments faster? Like there's a lot of things we can do around like skipping builds and stuff in certain situations, like the build deferring stuff we talked about. Mm-hmm. Like there's a lot of stuff in that category that I guess looking at this chart, I think the stuff in that category basically gives you the energy back to make it through to prod. Like if you're fighting against, I think the way you said it before, you're fighting against your tooling. Like if you're making a bunch of mistakes, what you're gonna do when you're first learning, and each time you make a mistake, that involves like a 1 minute wait because like something has to deploy and undeploy, and you have to like wait for that to happen. You just run out of energy faster, and you kind of want to give up. So yeah, I think making it easier for beginners can also just look like not making the process feel pointlessly difficult. Like the difficulty should come from you learning a hard concept. It shouldn't come from I made a mistake and I have to wait 3 minutes for something to roll back. You know.
Yeah. Agree. I think what Dax saying there is like there are a lot of things, actually a lot of things that we could do to help improve the current experience. Let's say people say, oh, they're adding 2 GSIs to their DynamoDB table, and that's guaranteed like fail, like CloudFormation deployment. Like, can we pull up the state and be like, hey, we can catch that before you deploy, right? Things like that. I think those things can take up like a lot of our time. But what I'm not quite sure from this conversation is, are we just going to make a list of things we're not going to do? Like, what are we trying to get to at the end of this? Like, have like a line where like how to separate stuff, identify stuff.
Yeah, basically what I'm trying to get to is like the sort of like you can see my cursor, right? So the kind of the spot where we are, I think generally like what sort of like Dax was getting at is accurate. Like lowering this down to this level, I don't know if that is totally worth it. Does that make sense to you guys? Right? Like, I mean, that's effectively what the premise of this conversation is, right?
No, if you can lower to that without compromising anything long term, right? Like
without compromising everything around. But I think the point Dax is trying to make is that like there will be somebody that'll be easier.
Yeah, because if we like hit the minimum of where we can possibly go with that constraint, the next rung down is by compromising, and someone out there will do that. So is there a point in marketing that when someone else, not just one, probably like I can probably list off like 5 or 6 different frameworks that will beat us with that angle always. So if we're thinking in terms of like, and the way I've been thinking about marketing is we just need to own a concept. And like, what is that concept? I know for sure it's not look how fast you can build your MVP. It needs to be something else. Like I said, in terms of what we do, like we should always, these other projects should always like inspire us to make stuff better.
Right. And I think that goes to like when I'm looking at like sort of Frank's list here, like solving the AWS quirk type stuff, that should always be sort of top of mind for us when we look at these other people, right? It's like, hey, clearly that part is easier and we can't quite get there because we're constrained by this quirk. And obviously, again, like the solution has to be balanced out, right? So we can't just like give up the thing while giving up sort of long-term sort of issues. But so that part I totally see of like we're drawing inspiration in many ways from like what they're doing.
Mm-hmm. I think,
so that is right, yeah. Sorry, yeah.
I think all 3 of us, right? Like we are not the type of like personality where we would pick something, be like, oh, let's give something cool to people that's not very useful down the road. But most of those ideas are every time we have a conversation of like, oh, should we just do something that's super easy for X, is I think it's either coming from a user asking, say, why can't you guys just do something, or it's from like one of the other frameworks like releasing, uh right, like a GraphQL solution, right? I'm like, oh, do we need to get user to create the GraphQL API, or can we, just link the front end queries, hit the DynamoDB table directly, and in our ideal stack, right? The front end, you're defining the queries, and like, yeah, why do we need to get them to define the queries? Why can't we, right? It seems usually coming out from comparing us to some of these easier to get started frameworks, or from the
Yeah.
user asking, right?
And that's funny. That's a good example because this even happens within AWS. Rarely, but it does happen. Like some of the app sync examples of the VTL to Dynamo Resolver, like that looks way easier. You just plug it in and it like just does all the queries to Dynamo. Like there's no Lambda function. Like that looks really easy and it's like more performant and there's like a lot of benefits to doing that. I don't think anyone looks at VTL and is like excited, so I think that's in our favor. But like why? But like we're not like drawn to compete against that because there's a clear ceiling you're gonna hit. Unless you're a very specific type of project, there's kind of a ceiling you're gonna hit. You're not gonna have like code reuse and a bunch of stuff like that. So yeah, I think Frank is right. It does come from. Yeah, it's never like internally driven. We're not sitting here and like coming up with some crazy thing. It's always we see something else out there, and I think on some level maybe like our stuff looks worse than that, or like someone brings something up.
Yeah. I mean, this was the thing that you were saying too, where it's like you're naturally just going to want to do that, right? Because that's what it's primarily what the world is about, right? Like, we just see everybody sort of doing it, so naturally we're inclined to do it as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that is a good thing on some level. Mm-hmm. I'm seeing one of the comments on like the like what stands out for SST for him is that of how comprehensive it is.
Yeah,
I think this one's a good one. Like the way I visualize some of the things that we're doing is like taking those bumps out is basically giving you a setup that has all these answers up front. Again, full disclosure, we don't have that yet, but that is what we're trying to get to. And yeah, I think on our side, it's like we want to smooth those things out. Every time you have a bump, you have to ask yourself this question, like a first principles type question of like, does it actually need to be there? And finally, I think like for people, and this is I think getting to the second time CTO type comment, or like, the quote unquote grown up type comment, is like for somebody that comes in that knows what they're looking for, and they see that we have answers to most of these things, those are maybe the type of people that we are trying to go after.
Yeah, I mean, Devin just made a comment. It's exactly that. Like, yeah, I think the people we serve well are people that are like in a research phase where they don't want to. And based on people I've talked to and how they've got into SSD, it feels like they've allocated some amount of time to like really think about how they're going to build their next thing, and they evaluate us. If people go through that process and they don't choose us, I'm like, okay with that outcome. Like, we didn't meet what they were optimizing for, and that's fine. Ideally some people do choose us, and that's great. But I think the issue that I'm feeling is I don't know how big that population of people are. It could actually be huge. It's very hard to get a sense of how often are people in that phase where that gives us an opportunity to convert someone. the things that I generally see, and this again, like I said yesterday, this could just be a bias of what shows up on the internet and like is in front of my eyes. It's yeah, it feels like everyone is jumping and doing prototypes on, or not even prototypes, jumping straight into building something with Next.js and Supabase, and it doesn't really feel like that was through like, okay, let me go build prototypes in 3 different things and pick the best one. It feels more like there's momentum behind these projects, and it feels like that's obviously the thing to use. Like, why even think about it? It's like a reflex.
Yeah. Yeah, Frank, did that part make sense to you? This point that Dax was sort of making of like, it's maybe a slightly irrational decision when they're picking which one to go with.
Yeah.
And it's like not even like a criticism, because there is so much noise out there, and it takes a lot of ability to parse through that. You're not really going to be able to evaluate a bunch of different things if you don't already have a lot of experience with making wrong choices. And there's just so much noise and like people saying certain things, and you don't know who to pay attention to. So it's natural that your choice ends up being kind of random. Yeah.
Yeah, it is freakish. I think, again, like, not to pick on Amplify here, but it is a little scary, like, having been through, like, I mean, like, even just like reading the docs, using parts of it, and then seeing it kind of grow almost out of control. It is scary when you see just like people like writing glowing reviews about like how amazing it is, and like you read that and you're like, I don't know, like, have they actually looked at it? Like, I don't feel like it's like I would personally say that. And yet, I mean, this goes to the sort of noise part of it, is that in at least the dev world today, there is a ton of noise around these things, and then like being able to show off like cool demos, or again, going back to our conversation, it's always like the visible part that's easier to sort of show off, obviously.
Yeah, it's yeah, like, I mean, with a lot of these things, it could literally be the best thing on the planet, but it's actually impossible for anyone on the planet to know that when it's just been out for 2 months. So that's where I think a lot of noise is in that category, where something gets a lot of consensus around this is good, when you really can't know for a long time. Like, I just think that, I mean, I think I've experienced this the first time. There's been so many cycles of this at this point, at least that I've seen, but I remember when I was first getting started, like Ruby on Rails was super, like, really hot. I remember like a cycle 4 or 5 years later where there were just a lot of migrations and pain around that. It's still actually, like, compared to other stuff, like, it's actually very, very good, and it's like lasted super long, and it still makes sense today for some people to start off of on that. But I just remember how many years it took for like that full cycle to complete, where, I mean, it's just a classic hype cycle thing. It took maybe like 3 or 4 years for people to say, okay, it's still good, but here's definitely the stuff that you're going to run into. Yeah. And even for SST, like, this is like a several year project to really know how good it can get.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, Frank, one of the things that I wanted to sort of get out of this one was also like, I know sometimes we've had these conversations where you're like, yeah, why don't we do, like X way of doing something that these other people are doing? I think it is still fair to continue to have those conversations. It's like kind of like what you're saying. It's like a case by case thing in some of these. It'll fall into one of these buckets. It might not.
Yeah, I mean, the other day Ross brought up that now he's deploying like to seed. He has a bunch of like sites, right? Like, so just creating like a stack or an app for each site. Does that seems quite a bit of boilerplate, right? Can we just put that in the ssc.json? Should we? Yeah. What's the? I think I think what he's saying trying to like make sense, and I feel his pain point, but what stance should we take? Be like, no, that's not what we're trying to do, or should we? Yeah, should we be like, hey, that's actually interesting. Can we like you can start with the stacks.json without writing any CDK code, and then you can eject into we'll run SSD eject. It will turn your SSD
Right.
stack.json into stacks.
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great example because I think the thing we'll ship won't be that easiest, the most like terse, easiest thing. Like, yeah, the easiest thing is just something like some of these other things like Vercel. It's like you almost just say, "Oh, this is an Next.js project," and everything is deployed for you. It's not going to be that easy. It's not going to be like a single field on the SCJSON. I feel like that's going to be useful, but I don't see any kind of long-term value from that. I see a lot more value in making SCJSON a JavaScript or TypeScript file, and then those importing the stacks. And then if you want, you can inline stuff there. That's definitely a lot better than what we have today, which is a lot more boilerplate. But there's like a logical like progression there where, okay, then you like extract that out into a stack, and it's all still you're copy pasting the same code. It was TypeScript to begin with. It's continuing to be TypeScript. Like it makes a lot more sense to me, and it's not. But the trade off is it's not like they have like one liner config file and you're ready to deploy.
Yeah. This is the part I do want to touch on now. I sort of mentioned this in passing before, but like I'm feeling this now where just having end-to-end type safety gives you a setup that I don't know if this is true, but like I at least I was getting the impression that it was true, is that like the effort it takes to add features is a little bit lower. Like it gets easier after you have stuff wired up properly. And seeing that in action, to me now it's like it's now a non-negotiable. And I also know this from like larger code bases, especially older code bases that you go back to. If things aren't wired up properly, it can be really hard to make changes. Frank obviously sort of knows this, but having seen that in action now, I would say that is like a non-negotiable.
Yeah, I think I'm realizing this is like connecting a few different things that I've thought about for a while. I think the way I can say this is I don't care about if you have task X. I don't care about making it faster to do task X. What I care about is after you finish task X, how tired do you feel? Like when you don't have type safety and that stuff, like there's just more tedious stuff you need to do. Like it just feels a little bit more tiring. It's not necessarily making you like super fast by having TypeScript, but I feel like it does make you less annoyed with like the work you have to do. I feel like if you have more energy left over, then you're going to work for a little bit longer, or the quality of what you're doing is going to be a little bit better. And that's what I care about more. Like, I mean, even if you look at my editor setup, there's a great argument to be made. I spend very few hours of my day typing, and people always say like, why do you go crazy with Vim? Like, like 2% of your day is typing, which is true. But when I have to do a bunch of tedious stuff, even if it's 2% of my day, it like ruins my day and I procrastinate it, or like it just makes me, like really has an impact. So having like stuff that makes me productive and it feels like I'm like less dumb when I'm doing that stuff. If you add that up day to day, it makes a huge difference. And it's kind of like similar to what I was saying before about just making those rough edges less rough. I think goes a longer way.
Yeah, I think to address like Frank's sort of question or scenario more clearly, I don't know what the right way is, and maybe Dax, maybe you have sort of the right sort of terminology for this, but like when different parts of your application or your system are like linked well together, which is what if you were to just put it in sort of like this JSON type thing, right? That's what breaks. When you have the thing like linked well together, it's like it's like easier to move things around because something will scream at you when you do that. Like B, it's like things are like, even though they're sort of linked well together, it allows you to like isolate and refactor parts well and cleanly. It's like the interfaces are sort of like better joined.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know what sort of the right thing is, but that is kind of what I'm trying to get to with this like second point, which is like this end-to-end type safety plus the domain-driven designness of it gives you a setup that makes it easier to work in like day to day. And that is the thing I don't think we should, like again, like it doesn't show up over the first day when you work on it, but within a couple of days you're like, wow, this is actually a pleasure to work on. Yeah, I don't know what you want to call that thing, but that I feel like is a worthwhile attribute that we should like hold on to. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I still feel like I want to find. I think it's. I'm not saying we need to solve it now. Just
Yep.
somewhere in my head, I feel like I want to solve when you land on our site. What's that message we send, and
Right.
that has to be. I feel like it has to be a completely different angle than
Easy
some
to
of the
get
other stuff
started.
that we see. Yeah.
Yeah, the thing I'm trying to get to here is like getting to it from sort of like the ground up, like getting to that message from the ground up. And it's like the message cannot be in violation of any of these sort of principles that you're trying to kind of put down, like, and I feel like that's not quite where we are. Now it is true, like if you look at kind of like our tagline of like, yeah, we're making serverless easier. That is true. But that like barely captures what we're actually trying to do.
Yeah,
Right. And
we probably wouldn't even say serverless in this.
yeah.
Concept.
But also you look at it's like this goes back to sort of the original point. The moment you say easier, it's actually, it makes it harder because it's like people can plant the flag just ahead of you, which is, hey, why don't you just use like Netlify functions, right? That's like serverless being easier, right? And now they have cron jobs, right? And then you sort of go down the list. It's like, oh yeah, like if you actually compare feature by feature, like eventually like they will sound a lot easier.
Yeah, I think Supabase I was looking on Subase's site. The first thing it says is build in a weekend.
Right.
It's like very different than what we're talking about.
Okay, I think we hit our 2-hour mark. I don't know if I can do more of that.
I'm so hungry.
Any closing thoughts, Frank? It sounds like you've got something to say.
I'm just, yeah, I think it's like open-ended. All right, it's I think this call is useful, so all of us are on the same page of like what do we mean when we say we're not trying to aim for something that's just easy.
Yeah. I just want to visualize the whole thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, are we just? It may mean that if there is
go
like a custom, like if you dissect the user base, right, for the people that just want to build a toy project, are we just saying like, no, this is not for you?
Right.
Are we saying that? Because if you're like saying that like, I feel very comfortable like drawing the conclusion from today's meeting. If you're like, nah, they can also. They should also use SSTM. Like, wow, that's not what we just said. Then it should be like you don't need to define your stacks. It should just be file based. You have an API folder, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think this goes back to, and this is something that we'll talk about in kind of our monthly conversation. It's like, what is the persona? Um, so
And like,
tangentially, if that sort of user base wants to use it, that's totally fine. But that is not the key persona we're after.
mhm. And there's also like, intuitively, I was always against, like Coinbase. I don't know when they released this feature where they had Coinbase, which is for simple trading, and there is what's that thing
Oh,
for advanced trading, like whether you do high
interesting.
frequency or whatever, right? You see those yeah, like different charts, and they kind of merge that. I haven't checked that. I haven't seen like a Coinbase in a while, but I saw now it's when you hit trade button, there's like two mode,
Oh,
like trade and advanced trade, right? Is that would that be like that's always sound like kind of like a like like a like very brutal way to support two group of users.
Yeah, I think
right.
it's compromise.
Yeah. But it's also like, if, and I can't paint this black and white, but if the transition between, let's say, like the simple trade and the advanced trade was something like this, where it wasn't smooth, it was a wall, then that is not a good option.
Mm-hmm.
And I go back to like the video game analogy quite a bit of like, they do this pretty well. They can't,
Yeah.
right? You can't go from like the initial walkthrough to like, oh, now you need to read a book to actually play the game. No, it's like it goes smooth, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, if I was to like put maybe one sort of word here, but the point I was trying to get across with the graph is that the line is actually smooth.
Yeah, smooth.
It's
Right.
not bumpy. So anyway,
Mm-hmm.
all right, yeah, that's quite a bit.
Yeah.
I think we'll talk about it a bit more in like the monthly call. But.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
All right, so you guys, thanks to everybody for joining.
Yeah.
Have a good
Thanks,
weekend.
Devin. Thanks, Abdel, for hanging
Yeah.
around. Yeah.
All right.
See everyone.
All right, yeah.